Hey there, welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely betrayed by someone close to you? It's one of the most painful things to go through, but what if I told you there's a way to turn that pain into something powerful? Alright, let's take a walk through this story. Imagine you're living what seems like the perfect life. Everything looks great from the outside. You've got the loving husband, the caring family, but something doesn't feel right. As time passes, you begin to notice little cracks in the foundation. And just like that, your world starts to crumble. Sounds familiar, right? Let's dive into this journey and see how one woman turned betrayal into something she never imagined. You won't believe what happens next. The protagonist, a patient and kind woman, lives in what many would consider the perfect family. She shares a home with her husband, Tom, and his mother, Linda. To the outside world, everything seems ideal. The three of them attend family gatherings together, often showing up as a united front, radiating warmth and happiness. Their house is the picture of tranquility, and when friends or relatives visit, they see nothing but smiles, polite conversation, and a bond that seems unbreakable. Social media only reinforces this image. The protagonist often shares photos of family outings, cozy dinners, and celebrations. They all appear so happy together, laughing in pictures, surrounded by gifts or in front of a Christmas tree, looking like the perfect family. The posts are carefully curated, each moment seeming more perfect than the last. No one could guess that behind these carefully crafted images, the reality of her life is far from flawless. But over time, cracks begin to show. The protagonist's mother-in-law, Linda, while seemingly kind and well-meaning to the outside world, subtly starts to assert control. At first, it's small things, comments about how the house could be cleaner, or how the food could be better. These remarks are usually made in front of guests, turning what should be a compliment into an uncomfortable critique. Linda criticizes her cooking or suggests that she should do more for her husband, making it feel as though she's never quite good enough. When Linda offers these critiques, Tom, her husband, stays silent. At first, the protagonist brushes it off, thinking that it might just be a generational difference or a harmless opinion. But as the days go by, the comments become more frequent, more pointed. Linda begins to question the protagonist's choices, whether it's the way she raises their children, her spending habits, or even her parenting style. It's subtle at first, like a tiny crack forming in the foundation of her self-esteem, but it's there, and it begins to grow. The protagonist tries to ignore it, convincing herself that her mother-in-law is just trying to help. After all, Linda has years of experience, and she's just looking out for her, right? But what initially seemed like innocent advice starts to feel more like criticism. Every interaction with Linda seems to undermine her in some way, and what once felt like a family bond is slowly turning into something more toxic. Linda's presence, once welcome and loving, begins to feel suffocating. Even more unsettling is Tom's indifference. At first, he might tell her not to worry about his mother's comments, saying things like, "She doesn't mean it like that," or "You know how she is." But over time, he stops defending her altogether. Instead, he sides with his mother. When Linda gets upset or makes another passive-aggressive remark, Tom just nods, agrees, or, worse yet, stays silent. He's not the partner she thought he was. She begins to feel like an outsider in her own home, as though she's fighting battles on two fronts, one against Linda's subtle manipulations and the other against the growing distance between her and Tom. This indifference from her husband is perhaps the hardest part. He's the one person she thought would stand by her no matter what. Instead, it feels as if he's chosen his mother's side. When she tries to talk to him about the growing tension, he dismisses her concerns. He says things like, "It's not a big deal," or "You're overthinking it." Every attempt to voice her discomfort is met with apathy, and the protagonist starts to feel more and more isolated. Soon, she begins to doubt herself. Is she overreacting? Is there something wrong with her? She starts questioning whether she's really the one causing problems, or if she's just being sensitive. But deep down, she knows something is wrong. The smiles in the pictures and the perfectly crafted social media posts no longer represent her reality. There's a storm brewing beneath the surface, and she can feel it. What's worse is that she can't talk to anyone about it. No one knows the truth behind the family's perfect image. Her friends, relatives, and even her own family members all admire her relationship with her husband and mother-in-law. She's stuck in a web of silence, unable to speak out about the tension that's slowly suffocating her. Every day, the weight of the situation grows heavier, and yet she feels trapped in a facade she can't escape. The tension, though invisible to the outside world, is building steadily inside her. She can no longer deny the subtle manipulations and the indifference that comes from her husband. The sense of isolation grows stronger, and she starts to wonder if this will be her life forever, trapped in a family where no one truly understands her, not even the one person who should. But what no one, especially her husband or mother-in-law, realizes is that beneath the surface, something is changing. The protagonist is no longer the woman she once was. She's not the silent, patient wife who quietly accepts the criticism. Deep down, she's starting to plot, and it's a feeling she's never experienced before. Revenge is beginning to take root, though no one would ever guess it yet. Over time, the subtle manipulation from Linda, her mother-in-law, begins to escalate. What was once small, seemingly innocent comments now becomes a consistent stream of passive-aggressive remarks. It feels as though no matter what she does, it's never quite good enough. Her cooking is the first thing Linda criticizes, though it's something the protagonist has always prided herself on. "Oh, this could use a little more salt," Linda would comment with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Or, "I think you should try a different recipe next time," as if her cooking could never be good enough to satisfy. At first, the protagonist tells herself that Linda might just be offering advice or that she's old-fashioned and doesn't know how to give a compliment. But it doesn't stop there. The criticisms seep into other parts of her life too, her home, her parenting, even her appearance. Linda starts commenting on the way she arranges the furniture, or how she should learn to keep the house cleaner. She suggests that maybe the children should be disciplined more strictly, as if her way of raising them is insufficient. There's always an underlying criticism, wrapped in the guise of helpful suggestions. It doesn't matter if the protagonist spends hours cleaning, organizing, or preparing a meal, Linda always finds something to critique. One evening, after preparing a lavish dinner for the family, Linda remarked, "You know, I would have served this with a different side dish. It would have gone better with something lighter." Even when her husband Tom praised the meal, Linda found a way to make it seem as if the protagonist still wasn't doing enough. The woman's frustration grows with each passing day, but she hides it, afraid of making things worse. She knows that any attempt to defend herself will only escalate the situation. Linda also begins to make comments about the protagonist's appearance. At a family gathering one evening, after the protagonist wore a new dress she had bought for herself, Linda muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to hear, "I guess that dress was the best you could do with your figure." The words stung, and though everyone else in the room remained silent, the protagonist felt humiliated. She laughed it off, pretending like it didn't bother her, but inside, a wave of self-doubt crashed over her. And still, Tom, her husband, does nothing. He remains silent, a passive observer to the growing tension in their home. When his mother makes her remarks, he doesn't defend his wife, nor does he even acknowledge the discomfort his mother's words cause. Sometimes, he might give her a quick smile or say something like, "Mom's just being mom," but that's where the conversation ends. He never stands up for her. The silence from Tom hurts more than anything else, for it's clear to the protagonist that he's chosen his mother's side, whether knowingly or not. Each time Linda's criticisms cut through the air, the protagonist's confidence erodes just a little bit more. She begins to question her own abilities, her own worth. The woman who used to feel secure in her role as a wife and mother now finds herself second-guessing every decision she makes. Did she really make the right choice when she decorated the living room? Was her parenting style really the best for her children? Did she look too frumpy today? These thoughts swarm her mind, especially after Linda's remarks. The constant barrage of small but hurtful comments makes it difficult for her to shake off the self-doubt. She tries to talk to Tom about it, but his responses are always dismissive. "You're overreacting," he tells her. "My mom doesn't mean any harm." It's as though he can't, or won't, see the pattern of disrespect that's emerging. His dismissal makes her feel even more isolated, like she's making a big deal out of nothing. The frustration builds in her chest, but she holds it in, afraid of creating conflict. The protagonist tries to stay composed for the sake of peace, but inside, she's struggling to hold everything together. The silence from her husband is worse than the verbal attacks from Linda. If Tom had just stood up for her, even once, it might have been easier to endure. But he never does. Instead, he becomes an enabler, allowing his mother to make her feel inferior without any consequences. Every time Linda undermines her, the protagonist feels more like an outsider in her own home. She's no longer the woman who once felt confident and loved. She's become a shadow, hiding behind a facade of politeness. As the days go on, the emotional weight becomes unbearable. She wonders if it's even worth trying to fix things. What would happen if she confronted her mother-in-law? What if she told Tom how she felt? But every time she considers it, she stops herself. She fears the fallout, the potential arguments, the damage it might cause. So, she stays silent. She swallows her frustration, her hurt, and her anger, pretending everything is fine, but slowly, her sense of self begins to wither. But despite the crushing weight of the abuse, there's a part of her that knows something has to change. The constant feeling of being undermined, dismissed, and humiliated is unbearable. She can feel herself starting to crack under the pressure, and it terrifies her. She has to do something, but what? Would she stand up for herself and risk everything, or would she continue to let this quiet abuse take over her life? The suspense builds, not only in her mind but within the very fabric of her existence. Something has to break, and soon. One evening, the tension that had been building for so long finally reached its breaking point. The family had gathered for a celebration, a milestone birthday for Tom's father, and the atmosphere was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the bustle of relatives catching up. Everyone was seated around a large table, plates piled high with food. The protagonist had spent hours preparing the meal, ensuring everything was perfect. But as soon as her mother-in-law, Linda, walked into the room, the familiar sense of dread crept over her. Linda, as always, made a beeline for the protagonist's food, inspecting the spread with a critical eye. This doesn't look as good as last time," she remarked loudly, just as other guests started to settle in. "You should really try using more herbs. And I think the potatoes could use a little more seasoning." The words echoed in the room, and the protagonist could feel the heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't the first time Linda had publicly criticized her cooking, but it was certainly the most humiliating. Her stomach churned, but she forced a smile and tried to brush it off. However, this time, Tom didn't step in. He didn't defend her, didn't even acknowledge the uncomfortable silence that followed Linda's comment. Instead, he laughed, as if it were just another playful jab. "Mom's just being honest," he said with a chuckle. "You know how she is." His words felt like a slap in the face. In front of everyone, he had just chosen his mother's side, dismissing the hurt his wife was feeling as if it were nothing. She could feel the weight of the betrayal like a heavy stone pressing against her chest. This was it, the final straw. It wasn't just about the meal, or Linda's never-ending criticisms. It was the fact that, once again, Tom had sided with his mother, treating her feelings as secondary, as if her worth was less than his mother's. She had been silent for so long, biting her tongue, convincing herself it was just a phase or that things would get better. But this public display of disregard for her dignity shattered the illusion of their marriage. She realized, in that moment, that she had been living a lie. The man she had married was not the person she thought he was. He had become an accomplice in Linda's cruel game, and it felt like a betrayal of the highest order. After that evening, the protagonist retreated to her own space. She shut herself in their bedroom, away from the noise of the party, and allowed herself to cry for the first time in ages. The weight of everything, the constant belittling, the loneliness, the emotional neglect, finally became too much to bear. The tears weren't just for the humiliation she had suffered, they were for the life she had lost, for the woman she had once been. She had spent years trying to please them, trying to keep the peace, but in doing so, she had lost herself. And in that moment, a shift occurred deep inside her. She was done being the victim. The anger she had suppressed for so long now roared to the surface. She realized that she had the power to change her life, to take control of her future, and most importantly, to stop letting Linda and Tom walk all over her. The thought of revenge entered her mind like a spark in the dark. For the first time, she began to consider what it would feel like to fight back, not just with words, but with action. The idea of revenge was intoxicating, but it wasn't just about getting back at them for the way they had treated her. It was about reclaiming her power, her sense of self. She didn't know exactly what form that revenge would take, but she could feel it building inside her, a quiet fire waiting to consume everything in its path. Would she expose Tom's flaws? Would she reveal Linda's manipulations to the family? The options seemed endless, and with every passing moment, the idea of taking control became more and more appealing. Yet, there was a part of her that hesitated, a small voice of doubt that whispered, "Is this who I've become?" She wasn't sure if she was ready to fully embrace the darkness of revenge. Could she really do it? Could she push herself that far, knowing that once she took the first step, there would be no going back? The suspense of her own decision weighed heavily on her. She didn't have all the answers, but she was certain of one thing: she would never allow herself to be humiliated like this again. The idea of revenge stirred something deep within her, a hunger for justice, for recognition, for control over her own fate. Every thought she had been pushing down now bubbled to the surface. Could she really break free from the chains that had bound her for so long? And if so, what would she do next? Would she expose the truth? Would she tear down the perfect family image they had created? The possibilities were endless, but the suspense was unbearable. The protagonist stood at a crossroads, unsure of where her path would lead, but knowing that something had to change. Something was about to happen, and she could feel the power shifting in her favor. In the days that followed her public humiliation, the protagonist's mind was consumed with one thought: revenge. She could no longer stay passive, playing the part of the dutiful wife in a family that had constantly undermined her. The anger that had built up over time now had a clear purpose. She would no longer be a victim. Instead, she would take control. But how? She needed a plan, something that would expose Tom for who he truly was and tear down Linda's manipulative hold over their lives. Her first step was to observe. She began to watch Tom and Linda more closely, taking mental notes of their behaviors, their weaknesses, the cracks in their polished facades. She noticed the way Tom would always try to avoid conflict, how he'd turn a blind eye whenever Linda crossed the line. He was passive, yes, but in his passivity, she saw an opportunity. His indifference wasn't just a flaw, it was his vulnerability. Every time he ignored her feelings, it was another link in the chain of his betrayal, one that would eventually come back to bind him. The more she observed, the more she saw how deeply entangled Linda had woven herself into their lives. Linda had a habit of playing the victim whenever things didn't go her way, manipulating people with her sweet smile and soft words. She was a master at planting seeds of doubt, but the protagonist had learned to see through her. She knew that Linda thrived on control and manipulation, using her own son to shield herself from any consequences. The protagonist had watched it happen over and over again, but now, she could see Linda's tactics more clearly than ever before. Linda's need for control was both a strength and a weakness, and she would use that against her. As the days passed, the protagonist's mind grew sharper. She began to piece together a strategy, subtle at first, but with the potential to be devastating. She started to change the way she interacted with Tom. Instead of confronting him directly about his betrayal, she carefully played the part of the loving wife, while planting seeds of doubt about his relationship with his mother. She began asking questions, acting as though she was concerned about his emotional distance. "Do you think your mom might be too involved in our lives?" she'd ask innocently. "I feel like we don't get much time to ourselves anymore. What do you think?" Tom's response was always the same, dismissive, as though it were no big deal. But each time she asked, she planted another seed. She would follow up with things like, "It must be hard for you, dealing with everything, with your mom needing so much of your attention. I'm sure you don't mean to ignore me." It wasn't direct manipulation, but it was effective. She was slowly making him question his relationship with his mother, without even realizing it. Meanwhile, Linda's vulnerabilities became clearer as well. The protagonist noticed how often Linda would boast about her ability to control situations, especially when she was in the company of others. Linda would make sly remarks about how she ran the house or took care of everything. The protagonist saw this as her opportunity to strike. She began to subtly undermine Linda's authority in private moments, planting doubts in Tom's mind about his mother's behavior. She would share little stories about how Linda had overstepped her bounds, all the while presenting herself as the concerned wife, worried about her relationship with Tom. But each story, each comment, chipped away at Linda's image as the perfect matriarch. As time went on, the protagonist became more and more confident in her plan. She was methodical, patient, and precise in how she played her cards. She carefully cultivated an image of herself as the misunderstood wife, the one who had been wronged but was still trying to hold things together for the sake of the family. Meanwhile, Tom's guilt was starting to creep in. He wasn't quite sure why, but he felt as though something had changed between them. His protective instincts, usually so strong when it came to his mother, were now starting to clash with his growing awareness of his wife's feelings. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the cracks were starting to appear. However, the protagonist was not yet ready to reveal the full extent of her plan. She knew that timing was everything. She couldn't rush it, couldn't show her hand too soon. There were still pieces of the puzzle to put together. But there was one thing she was sure of: when the moment came, she would strike, and when she did, it would bring everything crashing down. The audience could feel the suspense building, wondering what her next move would be. Would she continue to manipulate Tom emotionally, making him question his relationship with his mother? Or would she expose Linda's manipulations to the rest of the family, tearing her apart in front of everyone? Or, perhaps, would the protagonist take a more drastic step, something that would change the course of everything? The possibilities were endless, but one thing was certain: the protagonist was no longer the helpless wife she once was. She was a woman with a plan, and nothing would stop her from executing it. But as the tension mounted, the question remained: how far would she go? Would she stick to her calculated moves, or would the weight of her anger and betrayal push her to take drastic, irreversible action? Only time would tell, but for now, she was content to wait, biding her time, letting the suspense of what was to come hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. The first move in her plan was subtle but calculated, precise enough to plant a seed of doubt, yet powerful enough to make an impact. The protagonist had been biding her time, watching her husband and mother-in-law carefully, and now it was finally time to execute the first strike. She knew that her actions had to be bold enough to get their attention, but not so dramatic that it would give them the chance to retaliate immediately. Her eyes were set on Tom, her husband, and his hidden affair, an affair she had known about for months but had chosen to keep to herself until the perfect moment arrived. She had discovered the affair by accident, when Tom had carelessly left his phone unlocked one evening. She had hesitated, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. What she found shocked her, but it also gave her the ammunition she needed. His secret messages, his flirtatious texts, and his intimate plans with another woman, these weren't just affairs of the heart. They were lies, betrayals, and most of all, a weapon she could use to her advantage. The first part of her plan was simple. That afternoon, after a quiet lunch, she casually handed Tom his phone. "Your phone was ringing earlier," she said, her voice neutral, masking the turmoil inside. She had known that the woman would be calling during their regular afternoon chat. Tom didn't think twice as he took the phone, his face falling slightly as he glanced at the screen. But it was too late, the damage had already been done. The protagonist didn't look at Tom as he quickly silenced the phone, trying to play it off as if nothing had happened. But she could feel the tension in the air, a tension he could no longer hide. His fingers trembled slightly as he set the phone down, his eyes avoiding hers. She didn't say a word, just let the silence hang between them. His guilty conscience had already started to gnaw at him. She watched him squirm, his discomfort growing as the realization hit. She knew. She wasn't the same passive woman she once was. She was a woman with power, a woman who had taken back control. But that was only the first step. Next, she turned her attention to Linda, her manipulative mother-in-law. She had already noticed how Linda had been trying to manipulate situations to her advantage, and she had a plan to turn the tables. One afternoon, while Tom was at work, she invited Linda over for a girls' day. Linda, always eager to control the narrative, had no idea what was coming. They sat together in the living room, sipping tea as the protagonist feigned casual conversation. She made sure to lead Linda into a discussion about how well she thought the family was doing. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, her voice calm and collected. "About the family dynamics, how things are changing. It's amazing how you've always had a hand in everything. You've always been there to guide us." Linda beamed, clearly pleased by the praise. But the protagonist was careful, her words were laced with just enough flattery to lower Linda's guard. Then, in a moment of quiet, she casually mentioned something that made Linda's face blanch. "I've been thinking about the way you always seem to control Tom's decisions," she said, her tone almost conversational. "How you've always known what's best for the family. I think it's time for me to take more of a role, too. Don't you think?" The reaction was immediate. Linda froze, her smile faltering for a moment as she processed what had just been said. She had never been questioned like this before. The protagonist knew that Linda thrived on control, and now she was subtly planting the idea that the matriarch's reign was coming to an end. Linda stammered, trying to brush it off, but the seed had been planted. The protagonist could see the panic begin to set in, just beneath the surface. Linda was used to running the show, and the thought that her daughter-in-law might be stepping into her territory made her uncomfortable. The tension in the room was palpable. The protagonist remained calm, collected, her face a mask of neutrality as she watched Linda's unease grow. It was clear that Linda had never been challenged in such a way. And the best part? The protagonist hadn't even revealed her hand yet. Linda had no idea that this was only the beginning. Meanwhile, Tom's guilt was becoming more evident with each passing day. He could no longer look her in the eye without squirming, and when she asked him simple questions about his day, he gave short, clipped answers, clearly avoiding anything that might make him confront the truth. The protagonist knew that the affair was still going on. She had seen the evidence herself, but now, it was clear that Tom had realized the ground beneath him was shifting. He no longer had the safety of his mother's protection, and for the first time, he was starting to feel the consequences of his actions. The suspense hung in the air, both for Tom and Linda. They didn't know what was coming next, but they could feel the tension rising. The protagonist, however, remained calm, watching the chaos she had set in motion. She knew this was just the beginning, that their world was about to crumble in ways they never expected. And as the days passed, they grew increasingly paranoid, wondering what she would do next. What other secrets did she know? How far was she willing to go to get back at them? Tom and Linda tried to maintain their composure, but the fear of the unknown was creeping in. They knew that she had only just begun to show her true hand, and with every passing moment, they grew more desperate to stop the inevitable. Would they retaliate? Would they try to make her pay for exposing their secrets? The suspense was unbearable, and the protagonist couldn't help but smile at the thought. She was finally in control, and the game was only just beginning. The battle between the protagonist and her husband, Tom, along with her manipulative mother-in-law, Linda, had only just begun, but the stakes were already high. After her first strike, both Tom and Linda seemed to realize that they had underestimated her. She was no longer the passive, docile wife they had relied on. But they weren't about to let her win without a fight. Their counterattack came swiftly, attempting to regain control over her, but the protagonist was always one step ahead, her mind sharp, her emotions tightly guarded. Tom's retaliation started subtly. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Linda had tried to dominate the conversation once again, Tom took his wife aside. His expression was one of feigned concern, though there was a hint of desperation in his eyes. "What's going on with you?" he asked, his tone dripping with false sweetness. "I don't know what's happening, but you've changed. You're being so cold, so distant. You know I'm trying to make this work, right?" The protagonist met his gaze, her expression calm and unreadable. He was trying to gaslight her, to make her doubt herself, to make her feel like the problem was hers and not his. She could feel the old guilt creeping up, the familiar sensation of questioning her own actions, but she shoved it aside. "No," she told herself firmly. "You've done nothing wrong. He deserves this." "I'm not cold," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm just tired of the games, Tom. I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter." She didn't let her voice waver, even though part of her wanted to break down and tell him everything. She wanted to scream at him, to expose the truth about the affair, about everything. But no, that would only give him power. This time, she was in control. Tom, however, refused to give up. The next day, he tried again, this time questioning her in a different way. "What about us? Do you still love me? Do you still care? Because it sure doesn't feel like it. You've been so different since everything started." He used the vague language intentionally, knowing it would make her feel guilty, unsure, like she had caused some irreparable damage. But once again, she resisted the urge to fall into the trap. Instead, she stared at him blankly. "I don't think you care enough to ask that question. If you did, you would have paid attention to how I've been feeling for years. But you didn't." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Tom faltered, his expression shifting from concern to anger. He had never seen her like this before. For the first time in their marriage, he felt completely powerless. Meanwhile, Linda, never one to back down, started her own campaign of manipulation. She wasn't as subtle as Tom, but her attempts to regain control were just as dangerous. One afternoon, after Tom had left for work, Linda came over unannounced, determined to sow discord. She put on her usual facade of concern and affection, but it was clear that her true motive was to reassert her dominance. "You know, dear," Linda began, her voice sickly sweet, "I've been thinking a lot lately. Maybe all this tension between you and Tom is because you've been keeping things from him. Maybe you've been acting in ways that aren't helping your marriage. You don't want to lose him, do you?" The words were venomous, wrapped in a soft, nurturing tone. Linda had always known how to play on her son's emotions, and now she was trying to do the same with her daughter-in-law. But the protagonist was no longer the same woman she had been. She saw through Linda's false concern, the manipulation veiled as advice. She knew what Linda was trying to do, to make her feel guilty, to make her doubt her own worth. "I'm not the problem here," she responded, her voice low and steady. "If you want to talk about issues in this marriage, maybe you should start with Tom. You've been meddling for far too long. I won't let you control me anymore." Linda's face flushed with anger, but the protagonist didn't flinch. She had already won the first round. Now it was Linda's turn to feel the weight of her own manipulation. For a moment, Linda remained silent, the fury in her eyes clear, but she couldn't find the words to counterattack. The protagonist had stripped her of her power, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The tension between the three of them began to grow, a silent battle of wills. Every time Tom or Linda tried to manipulate her, she grew stronger. She was no longer afraid of their emotional games. But that didn't mean the weight of her actions didn't have an effect on her. At night, when she was alone in bed, doubts would creep into her mind. Am I becoming the villain in this story? The thought would often linger, like a shadow in the corner of her thoughts. She had once prided herself on being a good wife, a good person. But as the days passed, she could feel the darkness inside her growing. The satisfaction of getting back at Tom and Linda was undeniable, but was it worth the cost? Was she losing herself in the process? It was a struggle, a constant battle within herself. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt every time she executed a new part of her plan. But then she would remember all the years of humiliation, the constant manipulation, the feeling of being invisible in her own marriage. That guilt would disappear, replaced by the fiery determination to continue her fight. The room was in shock. The family was stunned into silence. No one knew how to react. Some people were trying to process the betrayal, others were whispering in disbelief. But the protagonist stood tall, watching as her husband and mother-in-law squirmed under the weight of their exposure. Her calmness, her composed demeanor in the face of everything, only added to the intensity of the moment. Tom tried to speak, his voice shaking, but the protagonist raised a hand, silencing him. "You don't get to explain yourself now," she said coldly. "Not after everything you've done." The suspense was palpable. What would happen next? Would Tom and Linda finally admit their wrongdoings, or would they try to justify themselves one last time? The protagonist didn't wait for their answers. She had exposed them for what they were. She had turned the tables, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. The family was still reeling, the weight of the truth sinking in. Some faces showed shock, others betrayal, but all were silent, watching the protagonist. This was her moment, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. She had finally taken back her power, and now she would let the reactions unfold. The audience was left hanging, wondering what would happen next. Would Tom and Linda crumble under the pressure? What would the family do now? The tension in the room was unbearable, and the protagonist stood, unflinching, as everything she had worked for began to unravel before their eyes. The room was thick with chaos. The once warm and inviting atmosphere of the family gathering had disintegrated into confusion and anger. Tom, his face twisted in a mixture of guilt and desperation, was pacing back and forth, trying to find the right words to salvage the shattered pieces of their relationship. He reached out to his wife, his voice trembling with emotion. "Please, you don't understand," he begged, his eyes pleading with her for a sign of forgiveness. "I never meant for things to get this far. I was confused. I love you. Please, give me a chance to make this right." The protagonist didn't even flinch. She stood there, calm and unmoved, as her husband's desperate pleas filled the room. There was no trace of the woman who had once silently endured his mistreatment. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had finally taken control of her own life. "You think I don't understand?" she replied coldly, her voice unwavering. "You had no problem understanding exactly what you were doing when you were sneaking behind my back." "No, Tom, I understand perfectly. I understand that you betrayed me. And there's nothing you can say that will change that." His face twisted in anguish, but she didn't waver. The time for excuses had passed. He had made his choice, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. The audience, as well as the people in the room, could feel the weight of her words. They could see that there was no room for reconciliation here. She wasn't going to let him worm his way back into her life with a few empty apologies. Tom's voice rose in desperation. "Please, I'll do anything. I'm sorry for everything. I made a huge mistake. Please, don't leave me. I'm begging you." But the protagonist remained unmoved, her gaze sharp, cutting through the pleas. "It's too late, Tom," she said, her words final. "You've made your choice, and now you have to live with it. I'm not the same woman you left behind. I don't need your apologies, and I don't need your lies. You destroyed our marriage, and now I'm walking away." Tom opened his mouth, trying to argue, but he could find no words. The realization that everything was over seemed to dawn on him in slow motion. The audience could see it in his eyes, the regret, the shock, and finally, the defeat. But it was too little, too late. Across the room, Linda, who had been trying to hide her discomfort during Tom's breakdown, finally spoke up. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice filled with disbelief. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I've always had your best interests at heart, you know that. I was only trying to help. You've been so difficult, and I had to." "You had to?" The protagonist's voice was sharp, cutting through her mother-in-law's defense. "You had to manipulate me, belittle me, and turn your son against me? You had to treat me like I was nothing in my own home? You had to play the victim when you were the one pulling all the strings? No, Linda, you are the one who needs to take responsibility. Not me." Linda's face flushed with fury, but her voice faltered. "You don't understand. I was just looking out for my son. You've never been good enough for him, and I only wanted what was best for him." The protagonist held up her hand, silencing Linda. "What's best for him? Or what was best for you?" she countered. "You've been controlling, manipulative, and cruel. You've made me feel small for years, but I'm done being your punching bag. You're exposed now, Linda. No more pretending." Linda opened her mouth to argue, but the protagonist's firm gaze shut her down. "I'm done with both of you," she said, her tone final. "You can continue lying to yourselves, but I'm walking away. I'm done being part of this toxic, manipulative family." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Tom stood, defeated, his shoulders slumped as he realized that this was the end of their marriage. Linda, meanwhile, glared at her, but there was no more fight left in her either. She could no longer manipulate the situation, her power was gone. The protagonist stood tall, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had finally done it, she had freed herself. No more lies, No more manipulation. She had taken control of her life, and now, she was going to walk away with her head held high. The silence was broken by the sound of her footsteps as she turned and began to walk toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. As she left the room, she could feel the heavy weight of years of emotional abuse lifting from her shoulders. She was free. But even as she walked out of the house, there was a lingering sense of suspense in the air. Was this really the end of it? Had she truly moved on, or was there more to her revenge? Would she find the strength to build a new life, or would the shadows of her past continue to follow her? The audience, along with those who had witnessed her strength, were left to wonder, what would happen next? Was her revenge complete, or had she just taken the first step toward a new chapter in her life? The questions hung in the air, unresolved, as the protagonist walked away from the toxic family that had once held her captive. To the outside world, everything seemed normal. But behind closed doors, the battle raged on. Tom and Linda were playing their mind games, trying to reclaim the power they had once held over her. But the protagonist wasn't going to back down. She wasn't the same woman they had once known. She had taken control, and now, she would finish what she had started. The suspense of what would happen next kept the air thick with tension. Would Tom and Linda retaliate with more force, or would they crumble under the pressure she was applying? The protagonist remained calm, unshaken by their attempts to manipulate her. The audience could feel the weight of the decision she had made, the path she had chosen. And as the days wore on, it became clear, the battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The time for playing games had come to an end. The protagonist had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, observing every move her husband and mother-in-law made. Every betrayal, every manipulation was now a weapon at her disposal. And now, she was ready to strike, but not in the way they might expect. She wasn't going to confront them privately. No, this time, the truth would come out in front of everyone, family, friends, anyone who had ever doubted her or taken her side. This was her final move, the one that would shatter everything. The stage was set. A family gathering was planned for the weekend, the usual social event where everyone would come together, pretending that all was well. It was the perfect moment. Her mother-in-law, Linda, had been pushing for it, hoping to maintain the illusion of family harmony, while Tom was more than happy to go along, pretending he had nothing to hide. But the protagonist had other plans. She had been quiet up until this point, letting her husband and mother-in-law feel secure in their false belief that they could still manipulate her. But tonight, everything would change. The family arrived, and as expected, the atmosphere was warm and cheerful, fake smiles plastered across faces, everyone acting as though there were no problems at all. But the protagonist could feel the tension bubbling under the surface. She was ready. She had everything in place, the messages, the screenshots, the recordings. Everything was meticulously organized. She had prepared for every possible reaction, every angle, every defense her husband and mother-in-law might try. She wasn't going to let them escape this time. As dinner progressed, the conversation moved from one topic to another, the usual small talk that filled these gatherings. But the protagonist didn't engage in the light-hearted chatter. Instead, she waited for the perfect moment. Her heart was steady, her face impassive, but inside, a quiet thrill ran through her veins. She had planned this meticulously, and now, she would finally take control of her own narrative. Finally, the moment arrived. With the family still chatting, the protagonist stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Her eyes swept over the group of faces, her husband, his mother, distant relatives, and even a few close friends. It was a moment of reckoning, and she was prepared to make them all see the truth. "I've had enough of the lies," she said, her voice calm but cold. It cut through the room, and the conversations died down immediately. All eyes were on her now. For too long, I've let you all believe that everything was fine, that I was the problem. But now, it's time for you to see what's really been going on. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, tapping a few buttons to bring up the first set of screenshots, messages between Tom and the other woman. She held up the phone for everyone to see. There were gasps, murmurs of disbelief, as family members leaned forward to take in the evidence. Tom's face went pale as he recognized the messages. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence was suffocating. His wife had known. She had been sitting on this information all along, and now, there was nowhere to run. The protagonist didn't stop there. You all need to know what Tom has been doing behind my back, she continued, her voice steady, unwavering. The affair, the lies, the deceit. He's been pretending to be a loving husband, but in reality, he's been betraying me for months. She flashed another set of messages on the screen, each one more damning than the last. The room was thick with tension. Tom's eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out, but there was no escape now. As the family processed the revelation, the protagonist turned her attention to Linda. Her mother-in-law, who had been the one pulling the strings all along, was now the target. The protagonist knew that Linda's manipulations had played a huge role in the breakdown of her marriage. Linda had always found ways to undermine her, to twist every situation in her favor. But now, it was time for Linda to face the consequences. You've all seen what Tom has been doing, she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at her mother-in-law. But Linda, you're just as guilty. You've been the one who's been manipulating and controlling everything from behind the scenes. You've been the one telling him that I'm not enough, that I'm the problem, that I don't deserve him. But now, everyone will see your true nature. With a steady hand, she pulled up the recordings, the countless times Linda had undermined her, belittled her, and tried to turn Tom against her. There were moments where Linda's words were captured, cruel and cutting, aimed to break her down. The recordings played, and Linda's face drained of color. She tried to speak, to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. There was no escaping it now. The days following the fallout were quiet, too quiet. The protagonist, now free from the emotional prison she had lived in for years, felt a strange emptiness creeping in. For so long, her life had been defined by the chaos of betrayal, manipulation, and toxic relationships. Her revenge had been swift, satisfying, but now, in the aftermath, she couldn't help but wonder if she had truly won. Was she free, or had she merely swapped one form of emotional entrapment for another? As the protagonist sat alone in her new apartment, the silence surrounding her felt both comforting and suffocating. The air felt lighter, no longer heavy with the weight of the lies she had been living. She had walked away from the man who had betrayed her, and the mother-in-law who had broken her down, but what did that leave her with now? What was the price of her revenge? She had exposed the truth to the world, but in doing so, she had ripped apart not only her marriage but her entire world. The sweet taste of justice was beginning to sour. While she had basked in the power of revealing their secrets, a question lingered in the back of her mind. Was it enough? The sense of victory she had felt in the beginning was now clouded with doubt. She had made them pay, but at what cost to her own peace of mind? She thought back to the moment she had walked away from Tom and Linda. The sense of liberation was powerful at first, but now it felt like an echo in the void. She had expected relief, freedom, but instead, there was only a deep, gnawing emptiness. Was this really what she had wanted? Had she truly found herself, or had she simply become a victim of her own anger? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her closest friend. "How are you holding up?" it read. She stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. She had told herself that she would never look back, that she had made the right decision, but now she was questioning everything. She typed out a reply, but before hitting send, she paused. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she reflected on everything she had gone through. Revenge had given her the power she had once lacked, but it had also stripped her of something more precious, peace. She had taken control of her life, but in doing so, she had found that the power to destroy was not the same as the power to heal. The protagonist had changed. The woman who once let herself be walked all over was gone, replaced by someone who could stand up for herself. But in the process, she had lost her innocence, her belief in the goodness of people. Now, she could see everything in shades of gray, not black and white. She had learned that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, came at a steep price. It was a double-edged sword, and now, she was left to pick up the pieces. As she stood by the window, looking out at the city below, she couldn't help but wonder if there was still more to her journey. Was this the end, or was this just the beginning of something else? A part of her knew that she had to heal, to move on and rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. But another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else waiting for her, something she hadn't seen coming. In the quiet solitude of her new life, she realized that while revenge had given her a sense of power, it had also left her with a lingering question: was I better off before, living in ignorance and pain, or am I stronger now, with the truth, no matter how much it hurt? And just as she was beginning to find some clarity, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was a soft knock, almost tentative, but the unmistakable sound of someone wanting to get in. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She didn't have many visitors, and the timing was unusual. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had Tom come to beg for forgiveness again? Or was it Linda, trying to manipulate her into taking them back? Maybe it was someone else from her past, someone who knew her before everything had fallen apart. Her breath caught in her throat as she walked toward the door. With each step, the uncertainty grew. She opened it slowly, not knowing what to expect, but knowing one thing for sure: this moment, like so many others before it, would change everything. The figure standing in the doorway left her speechless. It wasn't who she expected at all. In that moment, as she stared into the eyes of the person standing before her, she realized that her journey was far from over. In fact, it might have just taken an unexpected twist, one she hadn't anticipated. The door was wide open now, and the future, once uncertain, seemed even more elusive than ever. Would she walk away from it all, or would the new chapter of her life bring more challenges, more surprises? The story didn't end with her walking away from Tom and Linda. It didn't end with her revenge. It didn't even end with the lessons she had learned. It ended with the sound of a door opening, and the uncertainty of what would come next hanging in the air. The audience was left with a question that would linger long after the story had finished: what happens now? The protagonist's journey was far from over, and the final twist had only just begun.